Right, I'm talking to John Rettie on the 23rd of March 1995 in Delhi about what happened almost 40 years ago in Moscow. How did you first hear what Khruschev had said, the content of his speech at the CPSU Congress?
Well, we didn't really hear anything very detailed at all initially, but we saw that the day, or rather the night after the Congress was supposed to have ended, there was a huge crowd of black Zeeses and Volgas and other large vehicles outside the Central Committee building, and the lights there were on all night. So we knew something had gone on, but we had no idea what. Then rumours began circulating among sort of various Western communist correspondents and diplomatic circles, as they say, that Khrushchev had made a sensational speech denouncing Stalin as a murderer and a torturer. This scarcely seemed credible, but there were very consistent rumours about it. So we in Reuters filed a four-paragraph story, which we passed through the censorship. There was then prior censorship. And we didn't expect it to go through, and it never did. It never emerged. So we just sort of forgot it. And about a week later, I was due to go on holiday to Stockholm, and a young Russian I knew who, masqueraded, shall we say, as a dissident, came to me, or rang me up one evening and said, "You're going tomorrow morning, I've got to see you before you go." So he came to see me, and of course the very fact that he could come to see me through the militiaman on duty at the foreigners' block meant that obviously he had some authorization to get in, although he always pretended he didn't. So he came to see me and said, "I've got two amazing stories to tell you, and you'll be an idiot if you don't take them with you." So, not knowing quite who he was, whether he was KGB or not, I put on several Sibelius symphonies very loudly, and one or two of Beethoven and Tchaikovsky and so on, while he talked to me. And the funny thing was, he had not a single piece of paper with him. He had everything in his head. And he said, "I have a friend who is a local party secretary, and he's shown me a copy of this speech that Khrushchev has made to the party congress in closed session. And this is what he said." And he had it, well, I can't say it was word for word, but very, very full account, including some things that weren't in the version that the CIA got from the Polish Communist Party. For example, that incident when Khrushchev was talking about torturing arrested Communist Party bigwigs, and somebody suddenly shouted from the hall, "Well, why didn't you kill him? Why didn't you do something?" And Khrushchev stopped and said, "Who said that?" And there was a deathly silence. And he said, "I said, who said that?" Nobody spoke. He said, "You see why we didn't do anything?" And there was the other thing that didn't appear in the Polish Communist Party's version, was he said at one stage, allegedly according to this friend of mine, Stalin liked to humiliate us, his colleagues. And one evening at a party we were drinking and eating, and suddenly he said, "Ty chochol," you, chochol is a derogatory word for a Ukrainian, though Khrushchev wasn't a Ukrainian. He had been first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party for a long time, and he was born in South Russia. So Stalin was sort of happy to call him a chochol. He said, "You, dance the Gopak." And the Gopak is a very intricate dance with very difficult steps, which for a little roly-poly fat man would be quite tricky. And Khrushchev said, "So I danced." This didn't appear in the official version. Well, I suppose it was quite likely to have been true. So anyway, I took voluminous notes. He then told me another story about riots in Georgia after this speech had been read out. It was read out afterwards, just once, to party meetings in factories and farms and offices. And when it was read out in Georgia, everybody rioted. One might think because their own son was denigrated, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. There was a lot of tension in Georgia at the time, and this was sort of created the spark. So he told me these two stories about Russian soldiers being killed in Tbilisi and trains arriving in Moscow with broken windows and so on. So I had two amazing stories, but the most amazing, obviously, Khrushchev. So what did I do with it? For a start, did I believe it? And, I mean, if I did believe it, what would I do with it? So I rang up my Reuters colleague, Sidney Whelan, and said, I've got to see you before I go. I was going the next morning. So it was a very cold winter, and even though it was early March, there was snow all over the ground. It was minus 15 or 20 or something. So we met outside the Central Telegraph Office where we filed our stories from, and we trudged through the snow through the night for about an hour and a half at least, while I told him the story and paused under the lamp to consult my notes. And in the end, we decided we did believe it, partly because it coincided with the rumours we'd heard, partly because this fellow had given me some genuine information before, though of a very minor nature, but still it had been genuine. And partly because the New York Times correspondent, who was just a temporary man there, was leaving the same day, the next day, and he obviously was going to file what he knew from diplomatic circles. So we had the full story and a far better one, and we didn't like to be beaten on our own story. So we decided that we would break all the rules, that I would go to Stockholm and file a story from there. Something which people used to do often before the Second World War. People would fly from Moscow to Riga, file their stories, and fly back to Moscow. But after 20 or more years of Stalinism, people were not prepared to risk that. But this was such a big story, we just had to risk it. So I was going to stay with some Finnish diplomat friends, but the first night my then Finnish wife and I stayed in a hotel because I didn't want them to know that I was filing this story. So I rang Reuters, having worked all through the night. I rang Reuters and talked to the news editor, the wonderful Sid Mason, and said, Sid, look, I've got this story, but you absolutely must not use my name, nor must you give it a Moscow dateline. He said, fine, okay, leave it to me, we'll handle it. And I was in some fear and trembling about going back after doing this. So when I got on to copy, I adopted a phony American accent, as if it was someone else filing. And it took a long time to dictate the whole lot. At the end of it, the copy taker said, thanks, John. And so I failed miserably. And I filed the other story too. In the event they put the major Khrushchev story out from Bonn, quoting communist sources, which I thought was a bit off because there weren't any communist sources in Bonn. The Communist Party was banned and they didn't exist. So it wasn't very convincing. I think the other story came out from a Vienna dateline while the correspondent was away, but I suppose that was all right. And so 10 days later I went back to Moscow quivering. But the summer of '56, everything opened up. It was a great thaw, and I gradually got more and more confident. Then, of course, came Hungary, and everything froze again, got very nasty. And I began to be fearful and trembling again. Indeed, the next year, early 1957, a fellow calling himself a captain in the KGB, which he might well have been, started taking me out to lunch and accusing me of using this fellow as an anti-Soviet dissident to get into factories or to get him across the Finnish frontier, or various things which he'd suggested and I'd rejected. And there were all sorts of other accusations, and each lunch started by saying, well, my boss, the general, says it's all right, he knows you're a reliable fellow, so this matter we were discussing last week is okay. But then there's this other matter. So every time there was a new matter, and certainly they began to follow me about very ostentatiously. So, I knew that I was being followed to put the pressure on. So I went to the British ambassador and said, as we walked about in his garden, said, I'm afraid this has happened and I want you to get me out. So eventually the message was passed to Reuters, and they did get me out, but not for a week because the Supreme Soviet was in session. They said, you've got to cover that, which didn't endear me to them. But finally I went on a Finnair plane to Helsinki. But the night before, just in case, I stayed with my Finnair friends in the airport. And that was Vnukovo in those days, and went through customs and immigration, still in fear and trembling. Somebody from the British Embassy came to see me through, and everything went fine. I breathed a sigh of relief. I was on the right side, the outside, when a voice came over the tannoy, "Господин Rettie, please come back to the immigration." So shades of Siberia and Vorkuta appeared in the sky. You know, I thought, now this is it. I went back and they said, "You forgot to sign this form." That was all. So once again, all was well, and I was on the plane. But it was nerve-wracking while it lasted.
Let's get the chronology right. How long after the secret speech did you file from Stockholm? About 10 days?
Yes, it would have been about that, if I remember right now. I mean, it's a long time ago and my memory is a little dim, but I seem to remember that I went out about a week after the secret speech, and during that week these rumours had been going around. So it would be between a week and 10 days by the time I was in Stockholm. I forget exactly, but about that.
And how much later did the text appear through the CIA and in the Observer?
The text came out in June, so 3 months later. I believe there is an American journalist who claims to have been the first to break it, but she's not strictly accurate. She may be the first with the full text, but not the first to break the story.
It's a nice scoop, isn't it?
It was a nice scoop, but unfortunately my name wasn't on it. Couldn't be on it. And then, of course, when I got back to London, I got the sack from Reuters for getting into trouble. I don't know why, but they gave me the sack anyway. I said, really, if you get the sack for getting them the scoop of the 50s, you know, what happens if you don't?
What about journalists like Sam Russell? Were they able to get the story but not get it accepted by their papers? And what sort of situation was, for example, he in?
No, Sam was very helpful because he didn't believe I had been the one who'd got it out. He had some other theories. No, I don't think he did know it because, he knew that there'd been a speech and the general contents. It's possible that he and other Western communists might have been at meetings at which it was read out. But I'm not really too sure about it because I think some of the Western communist journalists doubted that there ever had been a speech, though it was difficult to doubt at the time as it was being read out. And the point was it was read out just once and then taken back. You couldn't study it, you had to remember what you were told. But I think the foreign communists really knew very little more than everybody else because they were excluded. Even East European communists were excluded from the secret session. There were only Soviet Communist Party members there. So they really wouldn't have known too much more than we did, but just a little. I think the real question is, you know, who authorized this fellow to tell me? Now, I saw him again in 1990 because I told this story to Moscow News and they published it, and I said, this fellow working for the KGB, he rang me up in a fury saying, "You're accusing me of being a stukach," which means a sort of KGB sneak, and it's not very nice, and my son's ready to kill you, and so on and so forth. And he always denied that he did it at the behest of the KGB. But of course, he couldn't have done it any other way. It couldn't have been, as he claimed, that a friend of his was a Communist Party secretary and let him read it, and then he came to me. He couldn't have come to me without authorization. Furthermore, he couldn't have suggested I get him out on a Finnair plane or across the Finnish frontier, knowing my Finnish connections, without authorization, or suggest that I change into Russian clothes and go with him to a factory, because my Russian then was quite good. No, there was no question about it. But the question is, you know, who put him up to it? And I've asked around, you know, so in the 80s and 90s when I was there quite a lot. Mikoyan's son, Sergo Mikoyan, says it must have been Khruschev. Because he said, actually, Khruschev wanted to make the speech in open session. And he said only my father supported him. Kaganovich, Molotov, and Malenkov were against it being made at all, and the others were shilly-shallying. So eventually he agreed to a compromise that he would make it in secret session, and in fact the speech began, "Comrades, we must not wash our dirty linen in public." But I asked somebody else on Moscow News, and they also reckoned it had to be Khruschev, because nobody else could have authorized it. Even though he'd said we mustn't wash our dirty linen in public, he wanted the West to know. And as we Western journalists, there were a handful of us at the time in Moscow, knew Khruschev from diplomatic parties and so on, so he knew me. Obviously, since you had to get exit visas, they knew I was going to leave. And my conviction really is, my supposition, is that Khruschev wanted it out, knew I was going out, knew me, knew I'd do a fair report, and told someone to tell this fellow to tell me. But the people I talked to in the 90s said, since the Central Committee and the Politburo decision was that this should not be publicized, to be in secret session, he couldn't officially authorize it, and therefore there'll be nothing written down anywhere. And it's no good looking through the archives because you'll never find anything. He probably didn't even do it on the phone, not knowing who might be listening to his phone. He probably just whispered to somebody, "Get this out, how can you do it?" Rettie, "Oh yeah, okay, yes." And someone of his complete confidence would have done it. Because otherwise it's impossible to think that anybody else would authorize it. And I think that's sort of how it all arose. But it is only supposition. We'll never know for sure.
And is the name of the guy who informed you now in the public domain, or is that still confidential?
Oh, no, he's in the public domain because I mentioned him in the Moscow News. He's called Kostya Orlov. And a rather pathetic character. His mother was persecuted by the KGB, and he used this as a reason why he couldn't have been working for the KGB. But of course it's a reason why he could have been, and probably was. I mean, he was under pressure. He was a very intelligent fellow, and he appears to have had a photographic memory, but he was very pathetic as well. And remains so. I think when I saw him 35 years later, he was very much the same, only he wasn't drinking anymore.